Sometimes life strips away everything you thought you were, leaving you with nothing but the choice to start over. That's exactly what happened to Annie Dalton when she stepped off the mail wagon outside Abilene with just a worn valise and a satchel of school books. Clayton Ridge, a wealthy cattleman, had put out word for a housekeeper before winter set in. What he got was a homeless teacher who scrubbed floors while quoting Shakespeare and taught his ranch hands to read by lantern light. She had lost everything in a fire back east and had nowhere else to turn. But what happens when a woman with no past starts bringing life back to a man's quiet, empty house? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Ridge Ranch stretched beyond the horizon like a promise that never quite reached its end. Clayton Ridge stood on his front porch, weathered hands gripping the rail as he watched the morning sun paint the grasslands gold. 34 years old and master of more acres than most men could ride in a week, yet the silence around him felt heavier than the humid Kansas air. His father's brass compass sat on the kitchen table where Clayton had left it after checking the property lines yesterday. The instrument had guided 3 generations of ridge men across this land, its needle always pointing true north, always finding direction. Clayton picked it up now, feeling the familiar weight of tarnished metal and worn leather. If only it could point him toward what he needed most, someone to breathe life back into the empty rooms of his house. 2 years had passed since typhoid fever claimed his father, leaving Clayton alone with 8,000 acres and a hollow ache that echoed through the ranch house corridors. He'd tried managing on his own, but dust gathered in corners where his mother's careful hands once kept order. Meals consisted of whatever the ranch hands' wives could spare, and evenings stretched long, with nothing but the whisper of wind through the eaves for company. The advertisement he'd posted at the general store was simple enough. Housekeeper wanted, room and board provided, must be willing to work through winter. Apply at Ridge Ranch, 5 miles north of Abilene. Clayton had expected replies from sturdy farm wives or perhaps a widow seeking steady work. What he hadn't expected was the telegram that arrived 3 days ago. Position available, will arrive Tuesday wagon. A. Dalton. Now Tuesday had come, and Clayton found himself pacing the front yard like a nervous colt. The mail wagon appeared as a distant speck, growing larger, until he could make out the driver's familiar slouch and the single passenger sitting straight-backed beside him. When the wagon drew to a halt, Clayton got his first look at Miss A. Dalton. She was younger than he'd anticipated, perhaps 28 or 30, with auburn hair pulled back in a severe bun and grey eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they saw. Her dress was plain brown wool, clean but showing signs of careful mending. What caught his attention wasn't her appearance, it was the way she carried herself, spine straight and chin lifted, as if she'd faced down the world and found it wanting. "Mr. Ridge," her voice carried the crisp pronunciation of someone educated back east, "I'm Annie Dalton. I believe you have need of a housekeeper." Clayton touched his hat brim. "Yes, ma'am, though I have to say, your telegram was mighty brief." She climbed down from the wagon with practiced grace, accepting no help from either man. "I find that actions speak clearer than words, Mr. Ridge. Would you prefer a detailed accounting of my qualifications, or shall I demonstrate my capabilities?" The wagon driver, old Pete Hawkins, chuckled as he unloaded her belongings, a single worn valise and a leather satchel that she clutched protectively. "This lady's got some spirit, Clay. Didn't say more than 10 words the whole ride from town, but she's got steel in her spine." Annie's fingers tightened on the satchel's handle. Clayton noticed how she positioned herself to keep it close, as if it contained something precious. "I trust actions speak louder than promises, Mr. Hawkins." After Pete rattled away, Clayton found himself studying his potential housekeeper more carefully. Her clothes were well made but worn, her shoes sturdy but showing miles of walking. Everything about her suggested someone who'd known better times, but had learned to make do with less. "The position includes room and board," Clayton said, leading her toward the house. "There's a small room off the kitchen that's been empty since my mother passed. Work would be cooking, cleaning, basic household management. I've got 3 ranch hands who eat dinner here most nights, and I'd expect you to handle their meals as well." Annie nodded, her grey eyes taking in the sprawling ranch house with its wide porch and tall windows. "How long since you've had proper household management, Mr. Ridge?" 2 years, more or less." Clayton opened the front door, revealing a hallway that had once gleamed with his mother's attention, but now looked tired and neglected. "I've been managing on my own, but I'm afraid I'm better with cattle than with keeping house." She stepped inside, and Clayton watched her face carefully. Many women would have been overwhelmed by the size of the house or dismayed by its current state. Annie simply walked through the rooms with a measuring gaze, noting what needed attention without judgment or criticism. "This is a beautiful home," she said finally, running her fingers along the dusty mantelpiece in the main parlor. "It wants care, not replacement." Something in her tone suggested she understood the difference between neglect and ruin. Clayton found himself wanting to know more about this woman who spoke like a school teacher but applied for work as a housekeeper. "The kitchen's through here," he said, leading her down a short hallway. "Rooms just off to the side. It's not much, but it's private and warm." The small chamber contained a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window facing east. Annie set her valise on the bed and placed her satchel carefully on the small table beneath the window. For just a moment, her composed mask slipped, revealing something fragile underneath. "This will do very well," she said quietly. "When would you like me to begin?" "Now, if you're willing. The hands will be expecting dinner in a few hours." Annie rolled up her sleeves without hesitation. "Then I'd better see what provisions you have available." Clayton's pantry and root cellar revealed the random accumulation of a man who bought whatever seemed practical without much thought for meal planning. Annie surveyed the chaos with the same measuring look she'd given the house. "You have good ingredients," she said, pulling out flour, dried beans, and salt pork. "They simply need proper organization and preparation." As she worked, Clayton found himself lingering in the kitchen instead of returning to his ranch duties. There was something mesmerizing about watching competent hands transform his haphazard supplies into the beginnings of a proper meal. But what struck him most was the way she moved, efficient and purposeful, but with an underlying grace that suggested refinement. "You're not from around here," he observed. "No." She didn't elaborate, focusing instead on kneading bread dough with practiced motions. "I came from the east." Long journey for a housekeeper's position. Her hands stilled for just a moment. Sometimes distance is necessary for a fresh start. Clayton sensed there was more to the story, but something in her tone warned against pressing further. Instead, he watched as she shaped the dough and set it to rise, then began preparations for the evening meal. "The hands are good men," he said. "Pete's been with the family since before I was born. Jake's young but eager to learn. Tom's quiet but dependable. They'll treat you respectfully." And if they don't? There was no fear in her voice, only curiosity about how he'd handle such a situation. "Then they'll find themselves looking for new employment." She nodded, apparently satisfied with his answer. Clayton found himself wondering what experiences had taught her to ask such questions. The afternoon passed quickly as Annie transformed the kitchen from a functional space into something that felt like home. She organized the pantry with military precision, scrubbed surfaces until they gleamed, and filled the air with the aroma of baking bread and simmering stew. When the ranch hands arrived for dinner, they stopped short at the sight of the table set with actual plates and napkins, instead of the usual grab-what-you-can arrangement. Pete whistled low under his breath. "Well, I'll be. Looks like we've got ourselves a proper housekeeper." Annie emerged from the kitchen carrying a steaming pot of stew, her hair slightly disheveled from the day's work, but her bearing still dignified. "Gentlemen, I'm Annie Dalton. I hope you'll find the meal satisfactory." Jake, barely 19 and easily flustered, stammered his thanks. Tom simply nodded and took his seat, but Pete, seasoned by decades of frontier life, studied Annie with frank curiosity. "You cook like someone who's had practice feeding more than just cowboys," he said. "I've had experience with meal preparation," Annie replied diplomatically, ladling stew into bowls. The meal passed with more conversation than Clayton had heard at his table in months. Annie had a way of drawing out the men with carefully placed questions about their work, their families, their thoughts on the approaching winter. She listened more than she spoke, but when she did contribute, her comments revealed an educated mind. Shakespeare had something to say about the nature of honest work, she remarked, when Pete complained about the endless task of mending fences. The labor we delight in physics pain. The Cowboys exchanged glances. Tom cleared his throat. You read Shakespeare, Miss Dalton. I find that good literature speaks to universal truths, she replied simply. Whether you're mending fences or tending cattle, there's dignity in work done well. After the hands returned to their quarters, Clayton helped Annie clear the table, something he'd never done when his mother was alive, but which seemed natural now. As they worked side by side, he found himself stealing glances at this woman who quoted Shakespeare while washing dishes. You're not what I expected, he said finally. What did you expect? Someone more. Ordinary, I suppose. He dried a plate slowly, choosing his words carefully. You speak like someone who's had considerable education. Annie's hands stilled in the dishwater. Education is a gift that follows you wherever you go, Mr. Ridge. Unlike other possessions, it can't be lost to fire or theft. There was something in her tone that made Clayton suspect she spoke from experience. He wanted to ask more, but the vulnerable set of her shoulders warned him away from the subject. I want you to know that this position is yours, as long as you want it, he said instead. You've already done more in one afternoon than I managed in 2 years. She looked up at him then, and for a moment he saw past her careful composure to something raw and grateful underneath. Thank you, Mr. Ridge. That means more than you know. That night, Clayton lay in bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of someone else moving through his house. He heard the soft whisper of pages turning in the room below, and found himself wondering what book had captured Annie Dalton's attention. For the first time in 2 years, the house didn't feel empty. In her small room, Annie sat by the window with her father's compass resting on the table beside her open book. She'd found it among Clayton's things while cleaning, and had been drawn to its honest simplicity. Like the man who owned it, the compass seemed to promise direction for those wise enough to trust its guidance. She closed her book, a volume of Emerson's essays, worn soft from years of reading, and prepared for sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she allowed herself a moment of cautious hope. Perhaps, in this quiet corner of Kansas, she might finally find the peace that had eluded her for so long. The last thing she heard before drifting off was the distant sound of cattle lowing and the whisper of wind through the grass. It was the sound of home, or at least the possibility of one. Annie's 3rd week at the Ridge Ranch had settled into a comfortable rhythm of early mornings and purposeful work. The house gleamed under her careful attention, meals appeared on schedule, and Clayton found himself looking forward to the quiet conversations that accompanied their shared tasks. What he didn't expect was to find his kitchen transformed into a schoolroom. The discovery came on a Thursday evening when he returned from checking the north pasture later than usual. Warm light spilled from the kitchen windows, and he could hear voices, not the rough banter of ranch hands grabbing a late meal, but something altogether different. He approached quietly, drawn by curiosity. Through the window, he saw Annie seated at his kitchen table with Pete, Jake, and Tom arranged around her like schoolchildren. Each man held a slate, and Annie was guiding Jake's hand as he struggled to form letters with a piece of chalk. Remember, the B and D face different directions, she was saying with infinite patience. Think of it as opening a book. The B opens to the right. Jake's weathered face was scrunched in concentration as he carefully traced the letters. Pete, who Clayton had never seen read anything more complex than a cattle brand, was copying words from a primer Annie must have produced from her precious satchel. Miss Annie, Tom said quietly, could you show me how to write my Sarah's name again? I want to send her a proper letter. Clayton watched, transfixed, as Annie demonstrated the letters with careful strokes. Tom had been courting Sarah Miller from town for 2 years, but had never learned to read or write well enough to correspond properly. The man's usual taciturn nature had melted away under Annie's gentle instruction. "That's beautiful, Tom," Annie said as he completed the name. "Sarah will treasure a letter written in your own hand." Clayton pushed through the kitchen door, and all four heads turned toward him. The ranch hands looked guilty, as if they'd been caught shirking their duties, but Annie simply met his gaze with calm dignity. "Mr. Ridge," she said, rising from her chair, "the men were interested in improving their letters. I hope you don't mind the use of the kitchen table." Pete cleared his throat, his weathered face flushed with embarrassment. "Sorry, boss. Didn't think you'd object to us learning a bit." Clayton looked around the table at his men Pete, who'd been riding the range since before statehood, Jake, whose enthusiasm often outpaced his common sense, and Tom, whose quiet competence had made him invaluable. They were good men, loyal and hard-working, but he'd never considered their education or lack thereof. "I don't object," he said slowly. "I'm simply surprised. When did this start?" "Few days ago," Annie replied, beginning to gather the slates. "Jake mentioned he'd like to read the newspaper without help. Tom expressed interest in writing letters. It seemed a worthwhile use of evening hours. Miss Annie's got a real gift for teaching." Pete added, his usual gruffness replaced by something approaching reverence. "Makes more sense in one evening than the schoolmaster back in my day managed in a year." Clayton pulled out a chair and sat down, studying the scene before him. The teaching certificate Annie kept in her satchel caught the lamplight water stained, but still bearing the official seal of some Eastern institution. Suddenly, pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. "You were a teacher," he said. It wasn't a question. Annie's hands stilled on the slates. "I was." "Where?" "A small town in Ohio. Nothing you'd have heard of." Jake looked between them with dawning understanding. "You mean Miss Annie was a real school teacher, like with a proper schoolhouse and everything?" "Yes," Annie said quietly. "I taught children from ages 6 to 16, reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, history." She paused, her voice growing softer. "Literature and poetry for the older students." "What happened?" Clayton asked, though he suspected the answer would be painful. Annie was quiet for so long that he thought she might not respond. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "There was a fire. The schoolhouse, the surrounding buildings, everything burned. I lost my position, my home, my books, everything except what I could carry." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken sympathy. These were men who understood loss. The frontier was littered with failed dreams and fresh starts. But there was something in Annie's tone that suggested her loss went deeper than simple misfortune. "That's why you came west," Tom said with uncharacteristic gentleness. "Sometimes a fresh start requires considerable distance," Annie replied, echoing her earlier words to Clayton. Pete leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Seems to me we're mighty lucky to have such learning come our way. Not many ranch hands get the chance to improve themselves with a real teacher." Clayton found himself studying Annie with new eyes. Her patience with the men, her gentle corrections, the way she made each small achievement feel significant, these weren't the skills of a housekeeper, no matter how capable. They were the instincts of someone who dedicated her life to education. "How long did you teach?" he asked. 8 years. I started when I was 18. "And you gave it up to become a housekeeper?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Annie met his gaze steadily, but Clayton caught the flicker of pain that crossed her features. "Sometimes circumstances dictate our choices, Mr. Ridge. I needed employment, and you needed a housekeeper. The arrangement serves us both." But as Clayton watched her carefully stack the teaching materials, he realized the arrangement might serve him, but it was a profound waste of Annie's talents. The woman sitting at his kitchen table possessed skills that could benefit not just his ranch hands, but every family in the county. "What if," he said slowly, "you were to continue these lessons, not as part of your household duties, but as something separate?" Annie looked up sharply. "Mr. Ridge, there are families around here whose children could benefit from proper instruction. The nearest school is 15 miles away, and most folks can't spare their children for such a journey during planting and harvest seasons." Jake leaned forward eagerly, You mean Miss Annie could teach the young ones too? I mean, Clayton said, his voice gaining conviction as the idea took shape, that hiding such talent in a kitchen seems like poor stewardship of a gift. Annie's hands trembled slightly as she set down the last slate. Mr. Ridge, I appreciate the sentiment, but I'm here as your housekeeper. I wouldn't want to presume. You're not presuming. I'm suggesting. Clayton stood and began pacing the kitchen, his mind working through the possibilities. We could clear out the old storage room, set up proper desks and a blackboard. Families could send their children for lessons, and you could continue helping the men with their letters in the evenings. A school, Pete said wonderingly, right here on the Ridge Ranch. It wouldn't be a formal school, Clayton clarified. More like private instruction. Families could pay what they're able or contribute with goods and services. Annie stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Mr. Ridge, you don't understand. I can't. Can't what? I can't teach again. Not formally. Not as I was. The pain in her voice stopped Clayton's pacing. There was more to her story than a simple fire, more to her exile than bad luck or poverty. Whatever had driven Annie Dalton from her teaching position to his kitchen table was deeper and more complicated than she'd admitted. Annie, he said gently, using her first name without thinking, what really happened in Ohio? She turned away from him, staring out the dark window at nothing. When she spoke, her voice was steady but hollow. The fire wasn't an accident, at least not entirely. There were accusations, questions about how it started. Some people, she stopped, her shoulders tightening. Some people thought I might have been responsible. The kitchen fell silent, except for the tick of the mantel clock. Clayton felt something cold settle in his stomach. Were you? Annie turned back to face him, and he saw tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. No. I would never. Those children were everything to me. I stayed to fight the fire, to help get them out safely. But afterward, when people needed someone to blame, they blamed you, Clayton finished. The investigation was inconclusive. There was no proof either way, but suspicion was enough. I couldn't continue teaching with such doubts hanging over me, so I left. Pete slammed his hand on the table. That's the biggest pile of nonsense I ever heard. Anyone with eyes can see you'd never hurt a child. Doesn't matter what we can see, Tom said quietly. Matters what folks believe. Jake, who'd been listening with wide eyes, shook his head vigorously. Miss Annie, you've got the kindest heart I ever met. Anyone who'd blame you for something like that is just plain stupid. Annie smiled through her tears. Thank you, Jake. But you can see why I can't formally teach again, if word got out about the accusations. Clayton felt a surge of protective anger toward people he'd never met, who'd driven this woman from her calling based on suspicion and fear. But beneath the anger was a growing determination. What if, he said carefully, the people here didn't have to know about Ohio? What if you were simply Annie Dalton, housekeeper turned tutor, helping local families with their children's education? Clayton. No formal school, no official position, just a woman with obvious teaching skills helping her neighbors. Would that be so wrong? Annie looked around the table at the three ranch hands, all of whom were nodding encouragingly. These men had seen her patience, her kindness, her genuine care for their learning. In their eyes, she saw not suspicion, but trust. I don't know, she whispered. What if someone found out? What if I brought trouble to your ranch? Clayton stepped closer, his voice firm with conviction. Then we'd face that trouble together. But I won't see you waste your gifts because of other people's fears and ignorance. For a long moment, Annie stood perfectly still, weighing his words against the caution that had governed her life since fleeing Ohio. Finally, she nodded slowly. Perhaps we could try. Quietly, just a few children to start. Pete grinned and slapped the table again. That's the spirit. Wait till I tell the missus. She's been fretting about young Bobby's reading. As the ranch hands dispersed to their quarters, full of plans and excitement, Clayton found himself alone with Annie in the kitchen. She was gathering her teaching materials with careful precision, but he could see the tremor in her hands. You're scared, he observed. Terrified, she admitted, but maybe that's not reason enough to keep hiding. Clayton picked up the water-stained teaching certificate, studying the careful script that declared Annie Dalton qualified to instruct in all common branches of learning. "This is who you really are," he said, holding it out to her. "Not my housekeeper, though you do that well enough. You're a teacher, and it's time you started teaching again." Annie took the certificate, her fingers brushing his briefly. "What if I've forgotten how?" "Then you'll remember. Some things are too much a part of us to be lost forever." As Annie climbed the stairs to her small room, Clayton remained in the kitchen, staring at the slates and primers scattered across his table. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as word spread about the informal lessons at Ridge Ranch. Some families would be grateful for the opportunity. Others might ask uncomfortable questions about Annie's qualifications or her past. But as he extinguished the lamps and headed to his own room, Clayton found himself looking forward to those challenges. For the first time since his father's death, he had something worth fighting for, beyond the mere maintenance of his property. He had a purpose that extended beyond his own solitude. And he had Annie Dalton, whose quiet courage in the face of unjust accusations had earned not just his respect, but something deeper and more dangerous: complete and unwavering loyalty. The leather-bound volume of Shakespeare's complete works had seen better days. Its burgundy cover was scuffed and faded, the gilt lettering worn nearly smooth, and the pages bore the soft edges that came from countless readings. Annie held it tenderly as she dusted the parlor, treating it with the reverence most people reserved for scripture. Clayton paused in the doorway, drawn by the sight of her cradling the book like a beloved child. 2 weeks had passed since the kitchen schoolroom revelation, and he'd grown accustomed to finding Annie surrounded by the tools of education, slates and primers scattered across surfaces, the scratch of chalk on slate echoing through the house during evening lessons. "That book's seen some wear," he observed, stepping into the room. Annie looked up, her grey eyes softening. "It was my father's. He gave it to me when I turned 16 and told me that Shakespeare understood the human heart better than any writer who'd ever lived." She opened to a random page, her finger tracing lines she clearly knew by memory. "We know what we are, but know not what we may be." "Hamlet," Clayton said, surprising them both. Annie's eyebrows rose. "You know Shakespeare?" "My mother insisted on it, said no gentleman should be ignorant of literature." Clayton moved closer, noting the careful annotations in the Marginsa lifetime of study contained in meticulous handwriting. "Though I confess I haven't touched those books since she died." "Perhaps you should. Literature has a way of speaking differently to us as we age and experience more of life." Annie closed the book carefully. "This morning Jake asked me about the balcony scene from Romeo and Juliet. He's hoping to court the baker's daughter in town." Clayton chuckled. "Jake's Romeo? That's a sight I'd pay to see." Don't underestimate the power of poetry to express what the heart struggles to say plainly. Annie's voice carried a note of gentle instruction. "Young love may be foolish, but it's also brave." The observation hung between them, carrying an undercurrent that made Clayton suddenly aware of how close they stood. Annie seemed to sense it too, stepping back to resume her dusting with unnecessary focus. "The lessons are going well," Clayton said, seeking safer ground. "Tom managed to write a letter to Sarah yesterday, first one he's ever composed himself. He has a poet's soul hidden beneath that practical exterior." Annie's face lit with the quiet pride of a teacher watching her students succeed. "Yesterday he compared the sunset to Sarah's hair. I told him to include that sentiment in his letter. And Pete is discovering that reading opens doors he never knew existed. Last night he asked if I had any books about cattle breeding or land management. He wants to understand the theory behind the practices he's learned through experience." Clayton found himself marveling at the transformation in his men. They approached their evening lessons with an enthusiasm that carried into their daily work. More than that, they carried themselves differently, straighter, more confident, as if education had given them a new sense of their own worth. "What about you?" Annie asked, her attention seemingly focused on arranging books on a shelf. "When did you last read for pleasure rather than necessity?" The question caught him off guard. When had he stopped reading? It had been gradual. First, the demands of learning ranch management after his father's illness, then the crushing grief and responsibility that followed his death. Books had become luxuries he couldn't afford time for. Too long, he admitted. I used to enjoy poetry, Whitman especially. I celebrate myself and sing myself, Annie quoted softly. And what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. You know Whitman. I taught his work to my older students. There's something about his celebration of democracy and individual worth that speaks to the American spirit. She paused in her dusting, looking out the window toward the vast expanse of prairie. Though I imagine his words mean something different here than they did in my Ohio classroom. Clayton followed her gaze to the endless grassland that rolled toward the horizon. Everything's bigger here. The land, the sky, the silence. Sometimes I think it either makes a person bigger too, or makes them feel small beyond measure. And which has it done to you? The question was quietly asked, but pierced straight to the heart of his solitude. Clayton considered deflecting with humor or changing the subject, but something in Annie's expression, patient, understanding, without judgment, encouraged honesty. Both, I suppose. The land makes me feel significant, like I'm part of something larger than myself. But the silence. He trailed off, struggling to articulate the loneliness that had become his constant companion. Makes the lack of companionship echo louder, Annie finished gently. Yes. The simple word carried more weight than lengthy explanations. They stood quietly for a moment, the understanding between them deeper than words. Annie returned to her work, but the quality of silence had changed from awkward to companionable, from empty to full of unspoken sympathy. Perhaps, she said eventually, you might join us for reading time occasionally. I've been reading aloud to the men after their lessons. Jake is particularly fond of adventure stories, but Tom seems drawn to poetry. What do you read? It varies. Last week we tackled some of Tennyson's work. Pete was surprisingly moved by The Charge of the Light Brigade. Annie smiled at the memory. He said it reminded him of cattle drives, the same mixture of nobility and foolishness in following orders without question. Clayton found himself intrigued by the idea of shared reading, of voices other than his own filling the evening hours. What would you read tonight? I thought perhaps some Walt Whitman, Annie said with a sideways glance. If you'd care to join us. The invitation was casual, but Clayton sensed the careful thought behind it. Annie had a way of drawing people toward their better selves, encouraging the ranch hands to read, now gently coaxing him back toward the intellectual life he'd abandoned. I'd like that, he said. That evening, Clayton found himself seated around the kitchen table with his men, watching Annie read with the skill of someone who'd spent years bringing literature to life for students. She held his mother's Shakespeare volume somehow. It had made its way into the rotation and was reading from As You Like It. All the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players, she read, her voice giving weight to each familiar phrase. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts. Jake leaned forward, chin propped on his hands. What's that mean, Miss Annie, about playing parts? It means we all change throughout our lives, Annie explained, closing the book, but keeping her finger marking the place. A person might be a child, then a student, then a worker, then a parent. Each stage requires different qualities, different strengths. What part are you playing now? Tom asked with unusual directness. Annie was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant. I suppose I'm between parts just now. No longer the teacher I was, but not yet certain what comes next. Clayton found himself studying her profile in the lamplight. There was something achingly beautiful about her honesty, her willingness to admit uncertainty rather than project false confidence. Maybe that's the best time, Pete said thoughtfully. When you're between parts, you get to choose what comes next, instead of just falling into it. Wise words, Annie agreed. Choice is a powerful thing, especially when it's hard to see the options clearly. After the men retired to their quarters, Clayton helped Annie clear the table. They worked in comfortable silence, but he found himself hyper-aware of her presence, the way she moved with quiet efficiency, the faint scent of lavender that lingered around her, the careful way she handled each book as if it were precious. "Thank you," he said as she prepared to retire. "For tonight, for the lessons, he gestured helplessly, unable to capture everything she'd brought to his home. "Thank you for letting me be useful again," Annie replied, "for seeing worth in what I have to offer." As she climbed the stairs to her room, Clayton remained in the kitchen, staring at the space where she'd sat reading. The house felt different now, not just cleaner or better organized, but alive in a way it hadn't been since his mother's death. He picked up the Shakespeare volume Annie had left behind, opening to the passage she'd read. The words seemed to pulse with new meaning in the lamplight, speaking to the possibility of reinvention, of new acts in the drama of life. Perhaps Pete was right. Perhaps being between parts was indeed the best time, the moment when choice mattered most, when a person could decide not just what came next, but who they wanted to become. The china cabinet in the dining room had stood locked and dusty for 2 years, its contents hidden behind glass doors that reflected nothing but emptiness. Clayton had avoided looking at it directly since his mother's death, the delicate porcelain inside too painful a reminder of genteel Sunday dinners and careful conversations over tea, which was why finding Annie carefully washing each piece at the kitchen sink struck him like a physical blow. "What are you doing?" The words came out harsher than he'd intended, born from surprise rather than anger. Annie looked up from the delicate teacup in her hands, her expression immediately apologetic. "I'm sorry. I should have asked permission. I found the key in your mother's recipe box and thought—" She set the cup down with trembling fingers. "I'll put everything back immediately." Clayton stepped closer, seeing the full extent of what she'd undertaken. The entire tea service was spread across the countercups and saucers, the elegant teapot with its hand-painted roses, the sugar bowl and cream pitcher that had been his grandmother's pride. Each piece gleamed as if new, restored to the beauty he remembered from childhood. "Don't," he said quietly, "don't put them back." Annie's hands stilled. "I only wanted to see them properly cleaned. Such beautiful pieces shouldn't be hidden away, gathering dust." Clayton picked up one of the saucers, remembering his mother's careful instructions about holding china properly, about the importance of maintaining family treasures. Mother used these every Sunday after church. She said fine things were meant to be used, not just admired. "They're exquisite," Annie said, her voice soft with appreciation. "Hand-painted, aren't they? The roses look like they might bloom at any moment. My grandmother's wedding china came from England in 1847. Clayton turned the saucer over, showing Annie the maker's mark on the bottom. Mother always said each piece carried the love of the women who'd used it before. "And now they're lonely," Annie observed, understanding flooding her expression, "waiting for someone to bring them back to life." Something in her tone made Clayton look at her more carefully. There was no judgment in her voice, only gentle sympathy for both the abandoned china and the man who'd abandoned it. "I couldn't bear to see them after she died," he admitted. "Too many memories." "What if," Annie said carefully, "we made new memories, better ones than sadness and loss?" Before he could respond, she was moving with quiet purpose, setting the kitchen table with the restored china. The transformation was remarkable. What had been a simple farmhouse table became something elegant, worthy of the porcelain gracing its surface. "There," she said, stepping back to admire her work. "Now, it needs proper tea to complete the picture." Clayton watched, mesmerized, as Annie prepared tea with the same careful attention his mother had once shown. The ritual was soothing, warming the pot, measuring leaves, timing the steeping. When she poured, the liquid was the perfect amber color his mother had taught him to appreciate. "Sit," Annie instructed, gesturing to the chair his father had always occupied. "Let's see if your mother's china remembers how to make tea taste civilized." Clayton obeyed, feeling oddly formal in his own kitchen. Annie served him with the graceful movements of someone accustomed to such niceties, then poured her own cup and sat across from him. For a moment, neither spoke, both absorbed in the simple pleasure of properly brewed tea served in beautiful cups. "It tastes different," Clayton said finally. "Better. More significant somehow, like the china adds weight to the moment." Annie smiled, her first truly unguarded expression since he'd startled her at the sink. "My mother always said that ceremony matters, that taking time to do things beautifully makes ordinary moments special." "Tell me about her." The request seemed to surprise Annie. She set down her teacup carefully, considering her words. She was a teacher too. Not formally, women couldn't teach after marriage in her day, but she never stopped educating. She taught me that knowledge was the one inheritance that could never be taken away. "Is she?" "Dead. Cholera. When I was 22. Father followed 6 months later." Annie's voice was matter-of-fact, but Clayton caught the underlying pain. "I was alone then, which made teaching even more important. The children became my family." Clayton felt a surge of understanding. They'd both lost their anchor parents, who'd provided not just love, but purpose and identity. The difference was that Annie had found new purpose in teaching, while he'd simply maintained what his father had built. "The fire must have been devastating," he said gently, "to lose both your calling and your surrogate family." Annie's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her teacup. "The hardest part wasn't losing my position. It was the children looking at me with suspicion instead of trust. Parents who'd welcomed me into their homes, suddenly crossing the street to avoid me. That's why you came so far west." Distance seemed the only way to escape the whispers. She met his eyes directly. "But distance doesn't erase memory. I still wake some nights, hearing those children's voices, wondering if I could have done something different to save the schoolhouse." Clayton leaned forward, his voice intense with conviction. "From what I've seen, you would have died before letting harm come to those children. Anyone who knows you would understand that." "But they didn't know me. Not really. I was their teacher, a figure of authority, but not truly part of their community. When crisis came, that distance made it easy to cast me as the outsider, the one to blame." The parallel to her current situation wasn't lost on either of them. Once again, Annie was the outsider, the Eastern woman in a housekeeper's role, teaching informally while maintaining careful distance from the community that might judge her harshly if they knew her history. "It won't be the same here," Clayton said firmly. "Won't it? I'm still the stranger, still in a position where one whispered accusation could destroy everything I'm trying to build." Clayton reached across the table, covering her hand with his. The gesture was impulsive, born from a protective instinct he didn't fully understand. "Not if you're not alone this time. Not if you have someone standing beside you who knows your worth." Annie stared down at their joined hands, her expression unreadable. When she looked up, there was something vulnerable and hopeful in her grey eyes. "Why would you take such a risk? You barely know me." "I know enough." Clayton's thumb brushed across her knuckles, marveling at the softness of her skin beneath the calluses earned through honest work. "I know you quote Shakespeare while scrubbing floors and teach grown men to read with the patience of a saint. I know you treat my mother's china like the treasure it is and make tea that tastes like civilization. That's not enough to build trust on, isn't it? Sometimes the smallest gestures reveal the largest truths about a person's character." They sat in comfortable silence, the weight of shared understanding settling between them. Outside, the first cold snap of the season rattled the windows, but inside the kitchen felt warm and safe, protected by more than just walls and roof. "The tea really is excellent," Clayton said eventually, reluctant to break the moment, but aware that they'd crossed some invisible line that would be difficult to uncross. "Mother's recipe," Annie replied, gently withdrawing her hand to refill their cups. "She always said the secret was in the timing, knowing exactly when to remove the leaves before the bitterness set in. Wisdom that applies to more than tea-making." "Indeed." Annie's smile held a hint of mischief. "Though I've found that a little bitterness, properly managed, can add complexity to the overall flavor." Clayton laughed, surprised by her subtle humor. "Are we still talking about tea? Are we ever really talking about just one thing?" Annie countered, her eyes sparkling with intelligence and something that might have been flirtation. As they finished their tea in the gathering dusk, Clayton found himself reluctant to end the ritual. The china had indeed made the moment special, but more than that, it had created a space for honesty and connection that seemed to exist outside normal time. When Annie finally rose to clear the table, Clayton stood too, helping her return the precious china to its cabinet. But this time, instead of locking it away, they left the doors open, the beautiful porcelain visible and waiting for the next occasion worthy of its use. "Thank you," Annie said as they prepared to part for the evening, "for trusting me with something so precious." "Thank you for bringing it back to life," Clayton replied, "for bringing everything back to life." As Annie climbed the stairs to her room, Clayton remained in the kitchen, staring at the open china cabinet. The porcelain seemed to glow in the lamplight, no longer a painful reminder of loss but a promise of renewed purpose. His mother had been right, fine. Things were meant to be used, to be part of life rather than monuments to the past. And perhaps the same was true of fine feelings, of the growing attachment he felt for the woman who'd transformed his house into a home simply by caring for it properly. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for both connection and confusion, but tonight, surrounded by the lingering warmth of shared tea and honest conversation, Clayton allowed himself to hope that some things like his mother's china and his own carefully guarded heart were indeed meant to be used rather than merely preserved. The faded daguerreotype slipped from between the pages of Annie's worn copy of Emerson's essays, fluttering to the kitchen floor like a fallen leaf. Clayton bent to retrieve it before Annie could react, his eyes taking in the image before she could snatch it away. The photograph showed a younger Annie surrounded by perhaps 20 children of various ages, all arranged in front of a white clapboard building. She stood in the center, one hand resting on the shoulder of a small girl, her expression radiant with pride and affection. The children's faces glowed with the unmistakable look of students who genuinely loved their teacher. "You kept this," Clayton said softly, studying the image, "even after everything that happened." Annie's face had gone pale, her hands reaching instinctively for the photograph before stopping mid-gesture. "I shouldn't have. It only makes the memories harder to bear. Or it reminds you of who you really are." Clayton held the daguerreotype carefully, noting the way Annie's dress in the picture was crisp and new, her hair arranged in an elaborate style that spoke of time and care. This was Annie as she'd been respected, established, surrounded by love and purpose. "Look how they're positioned around you," he observed, not standing stiffly for a formal portrait, but leaning in, reaching toward you. These children adored you. They were good children, bright, eager to learn. Annie's voice carried a wistfulness that made Clayton's chest tighten. Little Mary Hutchins there, in the front she was only 6, but could already read better than children twice her age. And Tommy Morrison beside her was a mathematical genius. He could solve problems in his head that would stump most adults. "What happened to them after the fire?" Annie was quiet for so long that Clayton thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "The school district couldn't afford to rebuild. The children were divided among other schools in neighboring towns, some too far for daily travel. Many simply stopped attending altogether." The waste of it struck Clayton like a physical blow. Not just Annie's exile from her calling, but the scattered education of children who'd clearly thrived under her care. The photograph was evidence of what had been lost, not just a building, but a community of learning that had clearly been something special. "This is why you can't sleep sometimes," he said, understanding flooding through him. "You're not just mourning your own loss, you're carrying the weight of what happened to them." Annie nodded, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "I see their faces in my dreams sometimes. Wonder if they're still learning, still growing, or if the fire destroyed their futures along with their school." Clayton studied the photograph again, seeing past the formal composition to the genuine affection radiating from every face. Whatever had happened afterward, whatever accusations had driven Annie from her home, this image proved the truth of her character more convincingly than any testimony could. "May I keep this for a moment?" he asked. "I promise to return it." Annie looked puzzled but nodded. Clayton slipped the daguerreotype into his vest pocket, already forming a plan that might be either brilliant or disastrous. The opportunity came 3 days later when Dr. Harrison made his monthly visit to check on the ranch hand's health. Clayton had known the doctor since childhood, a thoughtful man who'd studied back east before settling in Kansas to serve the frontier communities. "You've got a remarkable woman working for you," Dr. Harrison said over coffee, having just finished examining a cut on Jake's hand that Annie had cleaned and bandaged with professional skill. "Her knowledge of wound care and basic medicine is impressive. Where did she study?" "She was a teacher back east," Clayton replied carefully. "Lost her position in a fire." "A teacher?" Dr. Harrison's eyebrows rose. "That explains the competence. Many teachers receive training in basic medical care for their students." He paused, studying Clayton's expression. "You seem troubled by something." Clayton made his decision, pulling the daguerreotype from his pocket. "What do you see when you look at this?" Dr. Harrison examined the photograph with the same careful attention he brought to medical diagnosis. A teacher who was clearly beloved by her students. The children's body language suggests genuine affection, not fear or mere respect. This woman created a positive learning environment. "Does she look like someone who would harm children?" "Quite the opposite. She looks like someone who would die protecting them." Dr. Harrison handed back the photograph, his expression curious. "Why do you ask?" Clayton found himself explaining Annie's situation, the fire, the accusations, her exile from teaching. Dr. Harrison listened without interruption, his medical training evident in his careful evaluation of the facts. "Scapegoating," the doctor said finally. "It's a common response to tragedy. People need someone to blame, preferably someone outside their immediate community." He shook his head, sadly. "I've seen it happen with medical situations when I can't save a patient. The family sometimes needs to fault someone other than fate or disease." "So you don't think she was responsible?" "Based on what you've told me and what I observed today, absolutely not. That woman has the instincts of a healer, not a destroyer." Dr. Harrison leaned forward. "Clayton, why are you asking these questions?" "Because I'm thinking of asking her to marry me." The words tumbled out before Clayton fully realized he'd made the decision. But once spoken, they felt right inevitable, even. Dr. Harrison's smile was knowing and approving. "About time. I wondered how long it would take you to realize what was obvious to everyone else. Is it that apparent? You've been different since she arrived. More settled, more purposeful. And the way you look at her." Dr. Harrison chuckled, like a man who's found something he didn't know he was looking for. Clayton felt heat rise in his cheeks. "But her past is exactly that, past." Dr. Harrison stood, gathering his medical bag. "Clayton, I've seen you evaluate cattle and land with excellent judgment. Apply that same discernment to people. What does your direct experience tell you about Annie Dalton's character?" The question was simple but profound. Setting aside rumors and distant accusations, what did Clayton actually know about Annie? He knew she treated his ranch hands with respect and patience. He knew she handled his mother's china with reverence and served tea like a sacrament. He knew she read Shakespeare with genuine love and taught grown men their letters without condescension. He knew she made his empty house feel like home. "It tells me she's exactly what she appears to be," Clayton said quietly. "A good woman who's suffered unjustly." "Then trust that knowledge. Love isn't just about feelings, about choosing to build a life with someone whose character you respect." After Dr. Harrison departed, Clayton found himself walking the boundary of his land, the photograph in his pocket and the doctor's words echoing in his mind. The autumn air carried the scent of approaching winter, reminding him that seasons changed, whether one was ready or not. When he returned to the house, Annie was in the kitchen preparing dinner, her movements efficient and graceful. She looked up as he entered, and he saw the question in her eyes about the photograph's whereabouts. "Dr. Harrison thinks you're remarkable," Clayton said, returning the daguerreotype to her. That's kind of him. He also thinks the accusations against you were baseless. Scapegoating, he called it. Annie's hands stilled on the vegetables she was chopping. You told him about Ohio? I needed perspective from someone with education and experience reading people. Clayton moved closer, drawn by her obvious vulnerability. Annie, I need you to understand something. Whatever happened back there, whatever people said about you, doesn't matter here. Not to me, not to the men, not to anyone whose opinion should concern you. But if word spreads, then we'll face it together. The words came out with more conviction than Clayton had expected. I meant what I said before. You're not alone this time. Annie turned to face him fully, the photograph clutched in her hands. Why are you willing to take such a risk for someone you've known less than 2 months? Because sometimes 2 months of honest observation tells you more about a person than years of reputation and rumor. Clayton reached out, gently touching the edge of the photograph. Because I see how you treat the smallest kindnesses with gratitude, how you handle precious things with care, how you give of yourself without expecting anything in return. Clayton, because I think my mother would have loved you, he continued, the words flowing from some deep well of certainty. And because this house has been holding its breath for 2 years, waiting for someone to make it feel alive again. The kitchen fell silent, except for the tick of the mantel clock and the whisper of wind through the eaves. Annie studied his face as if searching for some sign of uncertainty or false comfort. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her because her shoulders relaxed slightly, and she nodded. The photograph was taken the week before the fire, she said quietly. It was the end of the school year, and I was so proud of their progress. They'd grown so much, learned so much. They still carry that learning with them, Clayton said firmly. Whatever happened to the building, whatever accusations followed, you gave those children something that can't be destroyed by fire or ignorance. That's your true legacy. Annie looked down at the photograph one more time, then carefully tucked it back into her book. I should finish dinner. Annie, she paused, looking back at him. What I said about facing things together, I meant every word. Her smile was small, but genuine. I'm beginning to believe you did. As Annie returned to her cooking, Clayton remained in the doorway, watching her transform simple ingredients into something nourishing and beautiful. The photograph was hidden again, but its truth remained visible in every gesture. She made the careful attention to detail, the instinctive nurturing, the quiet strength that had protected children once and now protected his own heart. Winter was coming, but for the first time in years, Clayton found himself looking forward to the long evenings ahead. The hand-carved chess set had been Clayton's father's pride of 32 pieces of polished walnut and maple, each one shaped with the patience of a man who understood that some things couldn't be rushed. Clayton found it gathering dust in the study closet, remembering how his father had taught him the fundamentals of strategy during long winter evenings. Do you play? He asked Annie one November night, after the ranch hands had retired to their quarters. Annie looked up from the sock she was darning, her needle pausing mid-stitch. I learned from my father. He said chess was the perfect teacher. It rewarded patience, punished impulsiveness, and never lied about the consequences of poor choices. Sounds like a wise man. He was. Annie set aside her mending and approached the board Clayton was arranging. Though I haven't played in years, I may be quite rusty. Clayton soon discovered that Annie's version of rusty bore little resemblance to actual incompetence. Her opening moves were cautious but sound, her development methodical. What impressed him most wasn't her skill, though, that was considerable, but her approach to the game. She played with the same thoughtful intensity she brought to everything else, studying the board, as if each position were a puzzle worth solving. Your father taught you well, Clayton observed after she'd executed a particularly elegant knight maneuver. He said chess was a conversation between minds. Annie replied, considering her next move. Each player reveals their character through their choices, whether they're aggressive or defensive, whether they think 3 moves ahead or 10. And what do my moves tell you about my character? Annie's lips curved in a small smile. that you're naturally protective. You castle early, keep your king safe, build strong defenses before launching any attacks. Clayton studied the board, recognizing the truth of her observation. And you? I take calculated risks, perhaps too many. Annie moved her bishop, creating a threat that Clayton hadn't anticipated. My father always said I played like someone with nothing to lose. The words hung between them, carrying weight beyond chess strategy. Clayton realized that Annie's entire approach to life since the fire had been that of someone with nothing left to lose, taking the risk of coming west, accepting work as a housekeeper despite her education, agreeing to teach again despite the potential consequences. Check, Annie said quietly. Clayton blinked, refocusing on the board. His king was indeed threatened, trapped by a combination he'd failed to see developing. How did you? You were focused on protecting your pieces individually, instead of considering how they work together, Annie explained. Sometimes the best defense requires coordinated offense. Clayton moved his king to safety, but the damage was done. Annie's position was clearly superior, her pieces working in harmony, while his remained scattered and reactive. The game ended 10 moves later, with a graceful checkmate that left Clayton both impressed and humbled. Rematch? He asked. Tomorrow night, Annie agreed. It's late, and we both have early mornings. But tomorrow night led to the next night, and the next, until chess became their evening ritual. Clayton found himself looking forward to those quiet hours in the study, the only sounds the soft click of wooden pieces and the occasional crackle from the fireplace. The games became a form of communication deeper than words of space, where they could challenge each other intellectually while revealing their innermost thoughts through metaphor and strategy. You're learning, Annie observed one evening after Clayton had successfully anticipated her favorite opening. Adapting your play to counter my tendencies. I had a good teacher. No, that's not teaching, that's growth. You're not just memorizing my patterns, you're developing your own style. Annie reset the board for another game. It's the difference between education and training. Training creates uniformity. Education develops individual potential. Clayton recognized the distinction as something that went far beyond chess. Is that how you approach teaching, developing each child's individual potential? I tried to. Every student learns differently, thinks differently. Some need careful explanation. Others learn best through discovery. Some require gentle encouragement. Others thrive on challenge. Annie's voice carried the warmth that always accompanied memories of her classroom. The art is in recognizing what each person needs and providing it. And what do I need? The question was more personal than Clayton had intended, but Annie didn't seem startled by it. She studied him with the same careful attention she gave to chess positions. Confidence in your own judgment, she said finally. You have excellent instincts, but you second-guess yourself. You seek validation for decisions you're perfectly capable of making alone. Clayton felt exposed by her perception, but not uncomfortable. Annie's observations were never cruel, only honest. And you? What do you need? Annie was quiet for so long that Clayton thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. Permission to be who I am, instead of who I think others expect me to be. The admission struck Clayton as profoundly sad. Since the fire, Annie had been living as a shadow of herself, hiding her education, minimizing her capabilities, apologizing for the very qualities that made her remarkable. You have that permission, he said firmly. From me, certainly, but more importantly, you need to give it to yourself. Annie moved a pawn, a simple advance that somehow felt significant. It's not that easy. When people have told you that your presence is unwelcome, that your judgment is flawed, that your very existence causes harm, those voices become part of your internal landscape. Then we need to replace those voices with better ones. How? Clayton considered the question seriously. How did one rebuild confidence that had been systematically destroyed? How did one learn to trust oneself again after experiencing such devastating betrayal? The same way you learn chess strategy, he said finally, through practice. by making small decisions and seeing good results, by having someone you trust reflect back your strengths until you remember what they are. Annie looked up from the board, her grey eyes searching his face. And you're volunteering for that role? I'm insisting on it. The chess game forgotten. They sat in comfortable silence, the weight of unspoken feelings settling between them like snow. Clayton found himself studying Annie's profile in the firelight, the determined set of her jaw, the way her fingers absently traced patterns on the chess table, the careful way she held herself as if ready to flee at the first sign of rejection. "Your move," she said softly, but Clayton sensed she wasn't talking about chess. He reached across the board, covering her hand with his. "Annie." "Yes? What if we stopped talking about chess and started talking about us?" Her hand trembled slightly under his touch. "What about us?" "About the fact that I've never met anyone who challenges me the way you do. About how these evening games have become the best part of my day. About how watching you bring life back to this house has made me realize how empty it was before you arrived." Annie's breath caught. "Clayton, about how I'm falling in love with you and don't know if you feel the same way." The words hung in the air between them, as irreversible as a chess move once the piece had been released. Annie stared down at their joined hands, her expression unreadable. "I feel," she said carefully, "like someone who's been living in winter for so long that the first hint of spring seems too good to be true." "It's not too good to be true. It's just spring." Annie looked up at him then, and Clayton saw tears gathering in her eyes, not sad tears, but the kind that came with overwhelming relief. "I've been so afraid," she whispered, "afraid of caring too much, of hoping too much, of allowing myself to believe that I could have something beautiful again." "You can," Clayton said, bringing her hand to his lips. "You can have whatever you're brave enough to reach for." For a moment, Annie looked as if she might pull away, retreat back into the safety of emotional distance. Then, as if making a chess move that would determine the entire game, she leaned forward and kissed him. It was a gentle kiss, tentative but full of promise. When they separated, Clayton saw that something had shifted in Annie's expression. A wall had come down. A decision had been made. "Your move," she whispered, echoing her earlier words but with an entirely different meaning. Clayton smiled, understanding that they'd moved beyond games into something far more significant. "I love you, Annie Dalton. Will you marry me?" The proposal was simple, direct, offered without fanfare in the quiet study where they'd learned to read each other's hearts through 32 wooden pieces. Annie's answer was equally simple. Yes. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, but inside the study, spring had finally arrived. The wanted poster was weathered from travel, its edges soft and ink slightly faded, but the sketch was unmistakably Annie's face. Marshal William Hayes smoothed it against the bar at Murphy's saloon, his weathered hands careful not to tear the delicate paper. "Woman goes by the name of Anna Dalton," he said to the assembled crowd of townspeople who'd gathered at news of a federal marshal's arrival. "Wanted for questioning in connection with the suspicious fire that destroyed the Millbrook School in Ohio. Multiple fatalities, significant property damage." Clayton felt the blood drain from his face as he stared at the crude but recognizable likeness. The artist had captured Annie's determined jawline and direct gaze, though the sketch made her look harder than she was, more calculating. "Says here she disappeared the night after the fire," the marshal continued, reading from a folded document. "Left town without notice, abandoning her teaching position and personal effects. Been tracking her west for the better part of 2 years. "What's the charge exactly?" Dr. Harrison asked, his voice carefully neutral. Clayton shot him a grateful look. The doctor was clearly buying time for information. "No formal charges yet," Marshal Hayes admitted, "but the state of Ohio wants her brought back for questioning. There's evidence suggesting the fire wasn't accidental, and Miss Dalton was the last person seen near the schoolhouse that evening." Preacher Morrison, a stern man who'd never approved of Clayton's unconventional household arrangements, stepped forward. "Are you saying we've been harboring a potential murderess?" "I'm saying I've been told to look for this woman, and I believe she's been living right here under an assumed name." The marshal's eyes swept the crowd, landing on Clayton. Word is Ridge hired himself a housekeeper a few months back. Eastern woman, educated, goes by Annie Dalton. Clayton felt every eye in the saloon turn toward him. The weight of their collective stare was crushing, but not as crushing as the growing certainty that Annie's carefully constructed new life was about to crumble around her. "I'd like to speak with this woman," Marshal Hayes continued, peaceful-like, "just to clear up some questions. No need for trouble if she's innocent, as she claims." "And if she's not innocent?" Preacher Morrison's voice carried the satisfaction of someone whose suspicions were being vindicated. "Then she'll face justice back in Ohio." Clayton's mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. Annie was at the ranch, probably preparing dinner, unaware that her past had finally caught up with her. He needed to warn her, but he also needed to understand exactly what they were facing. "Marshal," he said, stepping forward, "what evidence does Ohio have against Miss Dalton?" Hayes consulted his papers again. Witnesses saw her entering the schoolhouse after hours, the night of the fire. She was found the next morning with burns on her hands and arms, claiming she'd tried to fight the flames. But the fire started in multiple locations simultaneously, not the pattern you'd expect from an accident. "Sounds like she was trying to put out fires, not set them," Dr. Harrison observed. "Could be, or could be she got caught in her own trap." The marshal folded the poster carefully. "Point is, that's for a court to decide, not me. I just bring her back for questioning." Clayton felt trapped between honesty and loyalty. Everything in him wanted to deny Annie's presence, to claim ignorance and buy her time to disappear again. But lying to a federal marshal would make him complicit in whatever crime Annie was accused of committing. "She's at my ranch," he said quietly, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Preacher Morrison nodded with grim satisfaction, while Dr. Harrison's expression remained carefully neutral. "Appreciate your cooperation," Marshal Hayes said. "I'll ride out with you now, if that's acceptable. Like I said, I'm hoping this can be resolved peaceful-like." The ride to the Ridge Ranch felt like a funeral procession. Clayton's mind churned with questions he couldn't answer and fears he couldn't voice. Was it possible that Annie had set the fire? Could the woman who taught his ranch hands to read with infinite patience, who handled his mother's china like precious relics, who kissed him with trembling honesty, could that woman be capable of burning down a schoolhouse full of children? The rational part of his mind rejected the possibility completely. But doubt was a poison that spread quickly once introduced, and Clayton found himself remembering small moments. Annie's careful evasions about her past, her obvious fear of discovery, the way she sometimes woke from nightmares she wouldn't discuss. Annie was in the kitchen when they arrived, as Clayton had expected. She looked up at the sound of horses, her face brightening with a smile that died the moment she saw the marshal's badge. "Miss Anna Dalton," Marshal Hayes said, touching his hat brim. "I'm Marshal Hayes from the federal court. I need to speak with you about some matters in Ohio." Annie's face went white as marble, but her voice remained steady. "I see." "Annie," Clayton said, dismounting quickly, "this is about the fire. The marshal says Ohio wants you back for questioning." For a moment, Annie looked as if she might faint. She gripped the porch railing for support, her knuckles white with strain. Then, with visible effort, she straightened her spine and faced the marshal directly. "I'll come quietly," she said. "Just let me gather my things." "Hold on," Clayton interrupted, moving to stand beside her. "Marshal, what exactly is she accused of?" "Arson, potentially. Multiple counts of manslaughter if the fire was deliberate." Hayes dismounted, his manner professional but not unkind. "Miss, I understand you were the teacher at the school that burned." "Yes." "And you were there the night of the fire?" Annie's hesitation was barely perceptible, but Clayton caught it. "Yes," she said finally. "I went back to retrieve some papers I'd forgotten." "What time was this?" "Near 8 o'clock, after dinner. Witnesses saw lights in multiple rooms. You were alone?" Annie stopped, her composure finally cracking. "I was gathering materials for the next day's lessons. I may have lit lamps in several classrooms." Clayton felt his heart sink, This wasn't the full truth. He could hear it in Annie's voice, see it in the way she couldn't meet his eyes. But what was she hiding? "Miss Dalton," Marshal Hayes said gently, "the fire started in 3 separate locations simultaneously. The investigators found evidence of accelerant lamp oil spread deliberately to aid the burning. Can you explain that?" Annie's silence stretched long enough to become damning. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "There were people in town who wanted the school closed, who thought education was making the children too independent, too questioning of authority. I'd received threats." "What kind of threats?" "Anonymous letters saying the school would be shut down one way or another, that I was corrupting their children with ideas above their station." Annie's voice grew stronger as she spoke, anger overriding fear. "I was afraid someone might try to damage the building, so I went back that night to remove anything valuable: books, supplies, student records." "Why didn't you report these threats to the sheriff?" "Because half the town council agreed with them. The sheriff's brother-in-law had written one of the letters." Clayton felt pieces of a different puzzle falling into place. Not arson for profit or revenge, but a desperate attempt to save what could be saved from deliberate destruction. "So you were removing materials when the fire started?" the marshal pressed. "I was in the back storage room when I smelled smoke. By the time I reached the main classroom, the building was already burning in multiple places." Annie's voice broke slightly. "I tried to put out what fires I could, but there were too many, spreading too fast." "Why didn't you stay to fight it? Why leave town that same night?" Annie looked at Clayton then, her eyes filled with pain and regret. "Because I knew exactly what would happen. The same people who wanted the school destroyed would blame me for its destruction." And they did. Marshal Hayes consulted his papers again. "According to the report, you left without giving testimony to investigators." "What was the point? They'd already decided I was guilty. Staying would only have given them someone to arrest while the real arsonists went free." "So you're claiming someone else set the fire?" "I'm claiming that 3 prominent businessmen who'd been vocal about closing the school had both motive and opportunity. But I'm just a spinster schoolteacher, and they're pillars of the community. Who do you think a jury would believe?" The question hung in the air, highlighting the cruel mathematics of frontier justice. Clayton found himself wanting desperately to believe Annie's version of events, but doubt still gnawed at him. "Miss Dalton," Marshal Hayes said finally, "I'm afraid I still need to take you back to Ohio. A grand jury needs to hear your testimony and decide whether charges should be filed." "No." The word came out more forcefully than Clayton had intended. "If she's not formally charged, you can't just drag her back against her will." "Actually, I can. Federal warrant for questioning in a capital case gives me that authority." Annie placed a gentle hand on Clayton's arm. "It's all right. I always knew this day might come." "It's not all right," Clayton said fiercely. "You've done nothing wrong except try to build a new life." "Have I?" Annie's voice was soft, but her words cut deep. "Or have I been running from the truth for 2 years?" The doubt in her own voice was what finally broke Clayton's heart. Whatever had happened in Ohio, whatever small compromises or desperate choices she'd made, Annie had been carrying the weight of uncertainty about her own innocence all this time. "I need to pack," she said quietly, heading toward the house. As Clayton watched her climb the porch steps, he realized that everything, their engagement, their plans for the future, the careful trust they'd built between them, hung in the balance of whatever truth would emerge from her return to Ohio. The only question was whether that truth would set her free or destroy them both. Clayton's grandfather's wedding ring lay in the bottom drawer of his father's desk, wrapped in a piece of soft leather that had yellowed with age. Simple gold, worn smooth by decades of wear, it represented 3 generations of ridgemen who'd found women worthy of their love and commitment. Clayton had retrieved it the morning after his proposal to Annie, intending to present it properly once they'd set a wedding date. Now, as he turned the ring over in his hands, while Annie packed her few belongings under the marshal's watchful eye, it felt like a promise that might never be fulfilled. She's not guilty of what they're accusing her of, Dr. Harrison said quietly, having ridden out from town when word spread of the marshal's arrival. I've observed her carefully, Clayton. That woman doesn't have the capacity for the kind of calculated violence they're suggesting. Then why does she seem so uncertain? Clayton asked, his voice raw with frustration. Why won't she look me in the eye and simply deny it? Because she's been living with accusations and doubt for 2 years. Sometimes the weight of other people's suspicions becomes so heavy that you start questioning your own innocence. Through the window, Clayton could see Annie moving through her small room with mechanical precision, folding her few dresses and placing her precious books in the worn satchel. The marshal waited respectfully on the porch, but his presence was a constant reminder that her freedom hung by the thinnest of threads. There has to be something we can do, Clayton said, some way to prove her innocence before she's dragged back to face a jury that's already prejudiced against her. Perhaps there is. Dr. Harrison pulled out a folded paper. I've been corresponding with a colleague in Ohio about some medical matters, Dr. Samuel Morton in Columbus. He might be able to make inquiries about the actual investigation, find out what evidence exists beyond hearsay and circumstance. Clayton studied the letter. How long would that take? A telegram could reach him today. Response might come back within the week, depending on how thoroughly he can investigate. The marshal won't wait a week. He might if he believed new evidence was forthcoming. Federal marshals don't like bringing weak cases before grand juries. It reflects poorly on their competence. A spark of hope flickered in Clayton's chest. What would you need from Annie? Details, names of people who might have had motive to burn the school, specific dates and times, anything that might give Dr. Morton leads to follow. Clayton was already moving toward the house when Pete appeared around the corner, his weathered face grim with determination. Behind him came Jake and Tom, their expressions equally resolved. "Boss," Pete said, touching his hat brim, "we heard about Miss Annie's trouble." "Pete, I appreciate the concern, but this is a legal matter." "Hear me out," the old cowhand interrupted. "We've been talking, the three of us. That woman's been nothing but kindness itself since she arrived. Taught us to read without making us feel foolish, treated us like men instead of hired help. If she's in trouble, we stand with her." Tom nodded vigorously. "Whatever she needs testimony about her character, money for a lawyer, someone to ride to Ohio and speak for her, we're willing." Jake, his young face serious beyond his years, stepped forward. "Miss Annie saved my life when I got kicked by that stallion last month. Used her own petticoat to stop the bleeding and sat with me all night to make sure I didn't take fever. Woman like that doesn't burn down schools full of children." Clayton felt a surge of gratitude for these men who'd seen past Annie's reserved exterior to the gentle heart beneath. Their loyalty might not carry weight in an Ohio courtroom, but it mattered more than they knew. "Thank you," he said simply. "All of you. Right now, what she needs most is time to remember details that might help prove her innocence." "Then we'll see she gets it," Pete said firmly. "That marshal seems like a reasonable man. Maybe he'll listen to reason if it comes from enough voices." Annie appeared in the doorway, her valise in one hand and her precious satchel in the other. She'd changed into her traveling dress, the same brown wool she'd worn when arriving, and pinned her hair back severely. But despite her attempt to appear composed, Clayton could see the fear in her eyes. "I'm ready," she said quietly to Marshal Hayes. "Miss Dalton," Dr. Harrison interjected before the marshal could respond. "I wonder if you might spare a few minutes to help with a potential medical situation. There's been talk of cholera in the next county, and your knowledge of disease prevention could be invaluable." It was a transparent, delaying tactic, but Annie played along, perhaps sensing that Clayton and the doctor were trying to buy time for something. "Of course," she said, "though I'm not sure how helpful I can be." "Marshal," Dr. Harrison addressed Hayes directly, "the young lady's assistance could potentially save lives. Might we have an hour to document her knowledge before you begin your journey?" Marshal Hayes consulted his pocket watch, clearly weighing duty against humanitarian concerns. "1 hour," he said finally, "but I want to be on the afternoon stage to Topeka." As Dr. Harrison led Annie inside under the pretense of discussing cholera prevention, Clayton pulled Pete aside. "I need you to ride to town and send a telegram," he said urgently, "to Dr. Samuel Morton in Columbus, Ohio." He pressed a folded paper into Pete's hands. "Tell him it's urgenta. Woman's life may depend on his investigation. Consider it done, boss." While Pete thundered toward town, Clayton found himself pacing the front yard like a caged animal. Every minute that passed brought Annie closer to departure, but he couldn't shake the feeling that crucial information was just beyond their grasp. Tom approached hesitantly. "Boss, there's something Miss Annie told me once that might matter." "What?" "She mentioned that some of the men who wanted the school closed had tried to buy the property for a fraction of its worth. Said they claimed the building was a fire hazard and should be condemned." Clayton felt puzzle pieces clicking into place. "Fire hazard?" "Yes, sir. Something about the old wood construction and inadequate fire prevention. But Miss Annie said the building had been inspected just months before and found to be perfectly safe." "Who were these men who wanted to buy the property?" "She mentioned names, but I can't rightly remember them all. Something about a banker and a mill ownerman with money who saw opportunity in the school's closure." This was the kind of detail that could shift an entire investigation. If men with financial motives had been pressuring to close the school and acquire the property, it painted a very different picture of the fire's origins. Clayton burst through the front door, finding Annie seated at the kitchen table while Dr. Harrison took notes on supposed cholera prevention measures. "Annie," he said urgently, "I need you to tell me about the men who wanted to buy the school property." Her face went pale. "How did you—" "Tom remembered you mentioning it. This could be important if someone had financial motives to see the school destroyed. It changes everything." Annie looked between Clayton and Dr. Harrison, understanding dawning in her eyes. "You're trying to prove my innocence." "We're trying to find the truth," Dr. Harrison corrected gently, "and the truth is the best defense you could have." Annie was quiet for a long moment, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but filled with pain. "Samuel Blackwood owned the lumber mill and most of the commercial property in town. His brother-in-law, Jonathan Crane, was president of the Farmers Bank. Together they'd been pressuring the school board to sell the property for months before the fire." "Why?" "The school sat on prime commercial land near the town center. They wanted to build a new mill and expand the bank's operations. But the community supported keeping the school, and the board consistently voted down their offers." Dr. Harrison looked up from his notes. "Were these the same men who objected to your teaching methods?" "Blackwood's children attended my school. He complained constantly that I was teaching them to question authority instead of simply accepting what they were told. He wanted education limited to basic arithmetic and Bible reading." "And Crane?" "Had no children of his own but controlled most of the town's credit. Several families who supported the school owed him money. He'd threatened to call in their debts if the school wasn't closed." Clayton felt anger building in his chest. So they had both financial and ideological reasons to want the school destroyed. "Yes, but I could never prove they were behind the fire. And after it happened, they were the loudest voices calling for my arrest." "Of course they were," Dr. Harrison said grimly. "Nothing deflects suspicion like righteous indignation." Through the window, Clayton could see Marshal Hayes checking his watch again. Time was running out, but they were finally assembling a picture that might exonerate Annie completely. "Were there witnesses to their threats?" Clayton asked. "Mrs. Henderson, the mayor's wife, heard Blackwood say the school would be closed one way or another at a town meeting 2 weeks before the fire. And several parents could testify about Crane's death threats." "Names," Dr. Harrison said urgently, his pen poised. "I need specific names and addresses for my colleague to contact." As Annie provided details, Clayton found himself studying her face. The fear was still there, but underneath it was something he hadn't seen since the marshal's arrival. Hope. For the first time in 2 years, she was allowing herself to believe that the truth might actually set her free. Pete returned from town at a gallop, his horse lathered with sweat. "Telegram sent," he reported. "Operator said Dr. Morton should receive it within the hour." Marshal Hayes appeared in the doorway. Time's up, folks. We need to head for town if we're going to make that stage. Marshal, Clayton said, stepping forward with his grandfather's ring still clutched in his hand. I'm asking you to consider delaying Miss Dalton's departure. We have reason to believe new evidence may surface that could clear her completely. What kind of evidence? Dr. Harrison explained about his colleague's investigation and the new information about potential financial motives. Hayes listened carefully, his expression thoughtful. How long would this investigation take? Dr. Morton is thorough but efficient. I'd expect preliminary findings within days, possibly sooner, if the leads prove fruitful. Hayes studied Annie's face, perhaps seeing the same essential goodness that had convinced everyone else of her innocence. Miss, I can give you 3 days. If no substantial evidence emerges by then, I'll have to proceed with taking you back to Ohio. Annie nodded, tears of relief threatening at the corners of her eyes. Thank you, Marshal. That's more than fair. As Hayes departed for town, Clayton found himself alone with Annie on the front porch. The afternoon sun slanted low across the prairie, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Whatever happens, he said, taking her hands in his, I want you to know that I believe in your innocence completely. Even with all the doubt and uncertainty, Clayton opened his palm, revealing his grandfather's wedding ring. Enough to offer you this, to promise you a future regardless of what the past might bring. Annie stared at the simple gold band, understanding its significance. Clayton, if the investigation doesn't clear me, then we'll face whatever comes together, as husband and wife, if you'll have me. For the first time since the Marshal's arrival, Annie's smile was genuine and unguarded. Yes, she whispered, whatever comes, yes. As Clayton slipped the ring onto her finger, both of them understood that they were making promises in the face of an uncertain future. But sometimes, love required exactly that kind of courage, the willingness to choose hope over fear, trust over doubt, and commitment over the safer path of self-protection. The next 3 days would determine not just Annie's legal fate, but the entire trajectory of their lives together. But for this moment, watching the sunset paint the prairie in impossible colors, they had each other and the quiet certainty that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the odds. The telegram arrived on the second day, carried by a boy from town who'd ridden hard through the morning frost. Clayton's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the yellow paper, Annie and Dr. Harrison flanking him on the front porch, while Marshal Hayes looked on with professional interest. Investigation completed. Stop. Clayton read aloud. Evidence overwhelming. Stop. Blackwood and Crane indicted for arson and conspiracy. Stop. Witnesses came forward after learning of Miss Dalton's arrest warrant. Stop. Full exoneration follows. Stop. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Annie's sharp intake of breath. Clayton looked up to see tears streaming down her face, not tears of sorrow, but of relief so profound it seemed to transform her entire being. There's more, Dr. Harrison said, taking the telegram to read the additional lines. Dr. Morton writes that Mrs. Henderson provided testimony about overhearing Blackwood and Crane planning the fire. Apparently they'd been waiting for the right opportunity when Miss Dalton would be away from the building. But I went back that night, Annie whispered. I surprised them. Marshal Hayes stepped forward, his expression grave but not unkind. Miss Dalton, it appears you walked into a trap meant to destroy property, not hurt people. The fact that you were there when the fire started likely saved your life. If you'd been found dead in the ruins, their plan would have been perfect. Annie sank into the porch chair, the full implications hitting her. They wanted me to die in the fire. Or at minimum, disappear, Dr. Harrison said, consulting the telegram again. According to this, they'd spread rumors about your mental instability, suggesting you might harm yourself after destroying the school. Your body in the ruins would have been explained as suicide after a moment of madness. Clayton felt rage building in his chest at the calculating cruelty of men who would destroy an innocent woman to acquire a piece of property. But beneath the anger was overwhelming relief. Annie was safe, vindicated, free to build the future they'd planned together. The state of Ohio extends its formal apologies, Marshal Hayes continued, reading from an official document that had accompanied the telegram. All charges against Anna Margaret Dalton are hereby dismissed, and warrants for her arrest are rescinded. Furthermore, the state recognizes Miss Dalton's heroic actions in attempting to save school property and potentially preventing greater loss of life. Annie looked up at Clayton, her grey eyes bright with tears and something that looked very much like wonder. "It's over?" "It's over," he confirmed, kneeling beside her chair and taking her hands. "You're free, Annie, completely and absolutely free." "Miss Dalton," Marshal Hayes said formally, "I owe you an apology. The evidence as presented to me painted a very different picture of events than what actually occurred. I hope you can understand that I was simply doing my duty as it was explained to me." Annie nodded graciously. "You were kind and professional, Marshal. I harbor no ill will toward you for following the law as you understood it." Dr. Harrison was still reading through the additional documentation that had arrived with the telegram. "It says here that several of your former students provided testimony about your character and dedication to their welfare. Young Mary Hutchins, now 10, told investigators that you personally carried her out of the burning building and stayed to ensure all the children were safely accounted for." Mary remembered. Annie's voice broke with emotion. "She was so young." "Trauma has a way of preserving certain memories," Dr. Harrison said gently. "Apparently she's told anyone who would listen that Miss Dalton saved her life, not endangered it." Clayton watched Annie absorb this information, seeing years of guilt and self-doubt finally beginning to lift from her shoulders. The woman who'd arrived at his ranch carrying nothing but books and shame was transforming before his eyes into someone who could hold her head high again. "There's one more thing," Marshal Hayes said, producing an envelope with an official seal. "The state of Ohio has authorized a formal letter of vindication to be presented to any potential employer or community leader who might question Miss Dalton's character. It explicitly states that she is not only innocent of all accusations, but acted heroically in attempting to save school property and ensure student safety." Annie accepted the letter with trembling hands, understanding its significance. This wasn't just legal vindication, it was the restoration of her reputation, her ability to teach again, if she chose, her standing as a respectable member of any community. "I should return to town and send word that my investigation here is complete," Marshal Hayes said, preparing to mount his horse. "Miss Dalton, it's been an honor to meet you. Your courage in the face of false accusations is something to be admired." After the marshal departed, the three of them sat in comfortable silence on the front porch, watching the afternoon sun paint the prairie in shades of gold and amber. The ordeal was over, but its resolution felt almost too good to be true. "What will you do now?" Dr. Harrison asked gently. "Will you return to teaching?" Annie looked at Clayton, her expression both questioning and hopeful. "That depends on whether my fiancé still wants to marry a former schoolteacher." Clayton's answer was to stand and pull her into his arms, kissing her with all the relief and joy and love that had been building throughout the long nightmare of uncertainty. "I'll take that as a yes," Dr. Harrison said with a chuckle, discreetly averting his eyes from their embrace. When they finally separated, Annie's face was radiant with happiness. "I can teach again," she said wonderingly. "If I want to, I can teach again." "The question is," Clayton said, still holding her close, "do you want to?" Annie looked out across the vast expanse of prairie that surrounded them, then back at the house that had become her sanctuary, then finally into the eyes of the man who'd believed in her innocence even when she doubted it herself. "I think," she said slowly, "that I want to build something new, something that combines the best of what I was with the best of what I've become." Clayton smiled, understanding perfectly. Annie Dalton had been a teacher. Annie Ridgeford, that would be her name, soon enough could be something even better. A woman who'd survived injustice and emerged stronger, ready to create a life that honored both her past and her future. The letter of vindication rustled in the afternoon breeze, its official seal catching the light like a promise of redemption fulfilled. The wedding dress was a miracle of community cooperation, sewn from cream-colored silk that the general store owner had been saving for a special occasion. Mrs. Henderson, Pete's wife, had volunteered her considerable seamstress skills, while the other ranch wives had contributed lace, buttons, and tiny pearl beads that caught the light like dewdrops. Annie stood before the mirror in Clayton's mother's room, scarcely recognizing herself. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the dusty, desperate figure who'd stepped off the mail wagon 4 months earlier. This woman's eyes were bright with hope instead of shadowed with fear, her posture straight with confidence rather than bent with shame. "You look beautiful," Mrs. Henderson said, making a final adjustment to the lace at Annie's throat. "Like a woman who's finally found her place in the world." Through the window, Annie could see the preparations taking place in the front yard. Tables had been set up under the cottonwood trees, laden with dishes contributed by families from 3 counties who'd come to witness the marriage of Clayton Ridge to the woman who'd been vindicated so dramatically. Word of her story had spread quickly, the teacher falsely accused, the dramatic investigation, the complete exoneration that had revealed her heroism rather than guilt. "I'm nervous," Annie admitted, smoothing the silk skirt with trembling hands. "All brides are nervous," Mrs. Henderson replied with a knowing smile. "But you're marrying a good man who loves you for exactly who you are. That's rarer than you might think." A soft knock at the door announced Dr. Harrison's arrival. "The groom is getting anxious," he reported with amusement. "He's asked 3 times if you've changed your mind." Annie's laugh was bright and genuine. "Tell him that wild horses couldn't drag me away from this wedding." As she prepared to leave the room, Annie's gaze fell on her satchel of books, now resting on the windowsill where the afternoon light could reach them. The leather was still worn, the corners still frayed, but they no longer represented all she had left in the world. Now they were simply books-treasured companions that would help her build something new. The ceremony took place in the front yard, where Clayton had first seen Annie arrive. Preacher Morrison, who'd been among her harshest critics, had volunteered to perform the service as a gesture of apology for his earlier judgment. His words carried extra weight as he spoke about redemption, forgiveness, and the courage required to start over. Clayton stood beneath an arch of prairie flowers, his best suit pressed and his dark hair carefully combed. But it was his expression that took Annie's breath away, pure joy mixed with wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe his good fortune. Pete walked Annie down the aisle in place of the father she'd lost years earlier. The old cowhand's weathered face was stern with the gravity of the honor, but his eyes twinkled with affection for the woman who'd taught him to read poetry. "Take care of her," he murmured to Clayton as he placed Annie's hand in the groom's. "Always," Clayton replied, his voice thick with emotion. The ceremony itself was simple but heartfelt. They exchanged vows they'd written themselves, speaking of love that had grown from mutual respect, of trust rebuilt after betrayal, of commitment that could weather any storm. When Clayton slipped his grandmother's ring onto Annie's finger to join his grandfather's wedding band, she felt the weight of 3 generations of love and commitment. "You may kiss your bride," Preacher Morrison announced, and Clayton needed no further encouragement. The kiss was soft and sweet, full of promise for the future they'd build together. When they separated, the crowd erupted in cheers and applause that seemed to echo across the entire prairie. As the celebration continued into the evening, Annie found herself surrounded by people who just months earlier had been strangers. Tom presented her with a letter from his Sarah, welcoming her to the community of ranch wives. Jake had composed a poem, his first attempt at creative writing, celebrating her arrival and transformation of their lives. The most touching moment came when a delegation of children approached with a gift they'd made themselves. A small wooden sign painted with careful letters that read, "Mrs. Annie Ridge, Teacher." "We heard you might want to start a school," 10-year-old Bobby Henderson explained earnestly. "We wanted you to know we'd be your first students." Annie knelt to his level, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "I would be honored to be your teacher." As the evening wound down and guests began departing for their own homes, Annie and Clayton found themselves alone on the front porch, where they'd shared so many quiet conversations. The house glowed with warm light from within, and somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called across the prairie. "Any regrets?" Clayton asked, taking her hand and admiring the way his family's rings looked on her finger. "Only that it took so long to find you," Annie replied, leaning against his shoulder. "Maybe we both needed to become who we were before we could recognize what we had in each other." Annie considered this wisdom, thinking of the journey that had brought her from the ashes of her old life to this moment of perfect happiness. The fire had destroyed everything she thought she wanted, but it had also freed her to discover what she actually needed. "Mrs. Ridge," Clayton said, testing the sound of her new name. "I like the sound of that," Annie replied. "Though I think I'll keep teaching under my maiden name. Annie Dalton, educator. Annie Ridge, wife and partner. The best of both worlds. The best of all possible worlds." As they sat together in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the vast expanse of prairie that had become their kingdom, Annie reflected on the strange paths that led to happiness. Sometimes the worst thing that could happen to a person turned out to be the catalyst for the best thing that ever would. The dress rustled softly in the evening breeze, a reminder that some dreams, even when they seemed impossible, were worth fighting for. And sometimes, if a person was very lucky and very brave, those dreams came true in ways more beautiful than they'd ever dared imagine. The brass school bell rang clear and true across the prairie, calling children from 3 counties to the one-room schoolhouse that Clayton had built on a gentle rise overlooking the ranch. 1 year had passed since Annie's vindication and their wedding, and the sound of that bell had become the sweetest music in her world. Annie stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse, one hand resting on her rounded belly where their first child grew strong and active, the other shading her eyes as she watched her students approach. 23 children ranging in age from 6 to 16, all eager for the day's lessons. Some rode horses, others came in wagons with their families, and a few walked from the nearest homesteads. All of them carried the same expression she remembered from her daguerreotype in Ohio, the bright-eyed look of children who loved learning and trusted their teacher completely. "Good morning, Mrs. Ridge," called Mary Peterson, the blacksmith's youngest daughter. At 8 years old, she was already reading at a level that would have impressed Annie's former colleagues. "Good morning, Mary. Did you finish the arithmetic problems I assigned yesterday?" "Yes, ma'am, and I did extra ones too. Papa says numbers are like horseshoes. They have to be shaped just right to work properly." Annie smiled, marveling at how frontier wisdom could illuminate academic concepts. Her students brought perspectives shaped by practical experience, making them eager to understand how book learning applied to their daily lives. Clayton appeared around the corner of the schoolhouse, carrying the final piece of furniture for the new addition they'd been planning. As Annie's pregnancy advanced and enrollment continued to grow, they'd decided to expand the building to accommodate both more students and her changing needs. "The rocking chair fits perfectly by the east window," he reported, brushing sawdust from his hands. "You'll have good light for reading aloud and a comfortable place to rest when you need it." "Thank you." Annie reached up to brush a wood shaving from his hair, still marveling at how natural such gestures had become. "The children will love story time even more, with proper seating arrangements. Will you still be able to teach after the baby comes?" The question came from 16-year-old James Morrison, the preacher's son who'd become one of Annie's most dedicated students, despite his father's initial opposition to her methods. "For a while," Annie replied, settling her hand more firmly on her belly, "though I may need to adjust my approach. Perhaps some of you older students could help with the younger one-spear teaching can be very effective." The idea clearly appealed to James and several other advanced students. Annie had learned that frontier children matured quickly and took pride in sharing responsibility. Creating a system where older students mentored younger ones would benefit everyone involved. As the morning progressed, Annie found herself observing her students with the deep satisfaction of someone whose calling had been restored and expanded. Tommy Henderson was working through complex mathematical problems with the same determination his grandfather, Pete, brought to learning poetry. Sarah Millitom's wife now brought her baby to school some days and helped with the youngest children while pursuing her own delayed education. But it was Jake who provided the most remarkable transformation. The young cowhand who'd struggled to write his own name was now composing letters for other ranch hands and had even begun writing stories about frontier life. His latest tale, about a cattle drive through dangerous territory, had captivated the entire class. During the noon break, Annie sat in her new rocking chair and opened the letter that had arrived that morning from Ohio. Dr. Morton's correspondence had become a treasured connection to her past, bringing news of her former students and the community's gradual healing after the truth about the fire had emerged. Mary Hutchins is now 12 and teaching younger children in Sunday school. She read aloud to Clayton, who joined her for lunch. She told Dr. Morton that she wants to become a teacher like Miss Dalton when she grows up. "Your influence reaches farther than you know," Clayton observed, unpacking the meal Annie had prepared that morning. "Those children carry what you taught them wherever they go, as these children will carry what they learn here." Annie gestured toward her students, who were playing a geography game that turned memorizing state capitals into an adventure. "Education is like ripples in a pond. You never know how far the effects will spread." The afternoon brought a special visitor when Dr. Harrison arrived with a young woman Annie didn't recognize. She was perhaps 25, with intelligent eyes and the careful posture of someone accustomed to professional responsibility. "Annie, I'd like you to meet Miss Catherine Williams," Dr. Harrison said during a break between lessons. "She's recently arrived from Chicago and is interested in establishing a more formal school system in the county." Miss Williams stepped forward with obvious admiration. "Mrs. Ridge, your reputation as an educator has spread well beyond Kansas. I've heard about your innovative methods and the remarkable progress your students have made. I was hoping we might discuss the possibility of collaboration." Annie felt a flutter of excitement that had nothing to do with the baby's movements. "What kind of collaboration?" "A network of schools throughout the county with shared resources and coordinated curricula. You would serve as head teacher and curriculum supervisor, helping to train other educators in your methods." The proposal was both flattering and daunting. Annie looked at Clayton, seeing encouragement in his expression, then at her students, who were listening with obvious pride that their teacher was being recruited for such an important position. "I'm honored by your confidence," Annie said carefully, "but I'm expecting a child in the spring. My availability would be limited for some time." "Which is exactly why we need to establish the foundation now," Miss Williams replied. "Good educational systems require time to develop properly. We could begin with planning and teacher recruitment this winter, implement pilot programs next fall, and have you fully involved once your family situation allows." As the conversation continued, Annie found herself envisioning a future where quality education was available to every child in the county, regardless of their family's means or location. It was an ambitious dream, but no more ambitious than her own journey from homeless exile to respected educator and beloved wife. That evening, as Annie rang the school bell to signal the end of the day, she watched her students disperse across the prairie like seeds carried by the wind. Each one would carry knowledge and curiosity to their families and communities, spreading the influence of education in ways both large and small. "What do you think about Miss Williams's proposal?" Clayton asked, as they walked home together, his arm around her waist and her head resting on his shoulder. "I think," Annie said slowly, "that some opportunities are too important to refuse, even when they're complicated by other responsibilities. The baby won't be complicated, just different." Annie smiled, thinking of the child who would grow up surrounded by books and learning, who would see education not as a luxury, but as a natural part of life. Maybe that child will become the next generation's teacher, boy or girl. Either way, they'll learn that knowledge is the greatest inheritance we can provide. As they reached the house, Annie paused to look back at the schoolhouse silhouetted against the evening sky. The brass bell caught the last light of day, gleaming like a beacon that called to all who valued learning and growth. Clayton's grandfather's compass still sat on the kitchen table, but Annie no longer needed its guidance to find direction. Her path was clear now forward, into a future where love and learning went hand in hand, where the past's pain had been transformed into the present's purpose. The worn satchel of schoolbooks rested on a shelf in the parlor, no longer containing all her worldly possessions, but serving as a reminder of where she'd started and how far she'd traveled. Sometimes the most beautiful journeys began with the deepest losses, and the most precious discoveries emerged from the ashes of what had been destroyed. Annie Dalton had lost everything in a fire. Annie Ridge had found everything in the courage to begin again. And the brass school bell would ring tomorrow, calling new students to new possibilities, carrying the promise that some things love, learning, and the human capacity for renewal could never be destroyed by flame or fear or false accusation. The story that had begun with nothing but books and hope would continue for generations yet to come, written in the lives of children who learned that education was not just about memorizing facts, but about discovering the strength to transform both themselves and their world.